Thank you very much for that insightful address, Prime Minister. We would love for you to have a seat, and you've covered a lot of ground there, and a lot of oceans as well, and there are lots of questions coming through from the audience, so we'll go straight into them. You talked about us hosting APEC this year, and also this very special meeting that you are holding later this week. But what you also mentioned is this obvious shift in language from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. How significant is that, and why does it matter?
And this is something that really feels to me as if it's occurred over the last 4 to 5 years. And as you will have heard me reference in my remarks, you know, that none of that should diminish our starting point for our anchor within the region. And that is as a member of the Pacific. And so New Zealand is both simultaneously trying to build and strengthen its relationships within the Pacific to a much greater degree, whilst also then looking more broadly out to the Indo-Pacific region. But I wouldn't want us to lose that anchor point and the importance of strengthening that anchor point. And that's not just from the perspective of the way that we invest overseas aid and development or those diplomatic relationships. It extends to every element of our positioning in the region, including even the Defence Force and the way that it looks to the region and where it looks to prioritise its focus. So that's our anchor point. But then within that region, it is increasingly complex, it is increasingly contested, and to understand that complexity, that's where we draw in the wider Indo-Pacific. Because within that region, there is a stake and interest in our corner of the world, and if we are to promote those ideals and values that are most important to us, we must do that within that wider regional context, because they're increasingly looking into our backyard. So that's why it's important for me. It also enables us to build partnerships more broadly that are really important if we are to promote those values.
Okay. Prime Minister, I wanted to ask you about the Pacific. There is a competition for influence in the Pacific at the moment. We've seen China increase its presence there, but so too have Australia and the US, particularly after the Pacific reset. What would you like to see? What would you like to see the actions of Australia and other countries in the Pacific to support New Zealand?
So often the question of the Pacific is framed in such a way that it's a contest of influence, and you know, from my perspective, that does a disservice to our Pacific neighbours. These are sovereign nations. These are, in often cases, maturing democracies. Our Pacific approach and our Pacific reset was about actually acknowledging that we needed to move away from a donor-donee relationship to a much greater acknowledgement of the partnerships we needed to build, and that we needed to work alongside one another. So really changing the nature of that relationship in terms of our diplomacy, not just an approach to spend, which to me often is where the conversation for other countries tends to land. And in that regard, New Zealand's relationship with the Pacific will always, I believe, be different than others. As I've said, we share a population. We have responsibilities for nurturing Pacific languages in New Zealand. There's a very rich understanding of the cultural dynamics of the region that won't always be well understood in other parts of the world. So when I look to the relationship in the Pacific, in my mind, this is not about who outspends one another and therefore who has greater influence. It is about our relationships, and those are of critical importance to us, and they will always be different to the relationships other countries have in the Pacific.
There's a lot of competition here, not just for the Pacific, but for questions which get voted up. And there's two people fighting, obviously. Minister Mahuta recently suggested that Te Reti o Waitangi could provide a way forward for Aotearoa's foreign policy. How do you anticipate this nationally important document playing a role in reinforcing Aotearoa's values?
Look, there's many ways in which, both in a literal fashion, that our obligations there we're taking more broadly into our outlook in foreign affairs. One, a very literal interpretation, is the work that we're doing around trade and Indigenous trade. So as part of our role as APEC chair, we've been working very hard to elevate the role of Indigenous trade within the region. And Rachel Tolele, our ABAC chair, has been doing a brilliant job through ABAC of really lifting the profile of that piece of work, which has sat within APEC for some time, but now I think is really starting to take flight. So that's one very literal way, but that's not only for our domestic relationships here, but actually demonstrating what we believe can be done on the world stage. More broadly speaking, you can see as well the perspective that Minister Mahuta is taking into foreign policy and foreign affairs and the way that she approaches our relationships. For anyone who hasn't had the opportunity to look at Minister Mahuta's speech, for instance, to the China Business Summit, I really encourage you to take a look at that piece. It frames New Zealand's foundational principles in foreign policy and our particular relationship with China in a way that I see as completely unique. It acknowledges our history, but also in doing so, looks to the future. The Taniwha and the Dragon, I really encourage you to go and read up her approach there.
Now, I was actually going to save this question to last because I thought it was a good lead-in to Kurt Campbell, but it's very popular. And it's another question about Minister Mahuta, who suggested, I think it was at the Otago Foreign Policy School conference, that New Zealand would look to work more closely with the Quad. Is that something that you'd like to see happen, and how could that happen?
Oh, look, as great believers in a multilateral approach and as great believers in building partnerships within region and outside of region, then yes, there's multiple areas in which we will be looking to work alongside like-minded countries and build those partnerships. So yes, that is one of the things that we have flagged. Thank
you. Another one here, and actually relevant for everyone, but especially for about a third of our audience who are young people. And the OE has been a rite of passage for young New Zealanders and a really useful way for building international connections and understanding. How do we continue to do that, and how do we continue to engage globally when our borders are closed?
A good question. Well, the first thing I would say is that our border closures have really affected our people-to-people connection and contact. Our supply chains have remained open. You see many of our exporters have done very well relative to what you may have expected in a COVID environment. So it really is that people-to-people that we've suffered from in recent times. My first message to young people is that the world will not always be this way as we are right now. But it was Professor David Skegg who said to me recently something that really stood out to me. He said, the world has not been the same since 9/11. And it hasn't. There are things that fundamentally changed as a result of that experience. And perhaps I remember that more acutely because I was in the United States studying at Arizona State University when 9/11 occurred. And I remember not only the massive shift you felt in the global political environment, I also remember seeing the practical changes. As I travelled into the States, it was a very different experience as I then travelled out of the United States. And that movement has changed for good. Now, our borders post-COVID-19 will also likely change for good. That doesn't necessarily mean that every time you travel, you're going to be locked up in 14 days of managed isolation. But it does probably mean countries will integrate health testing or vaccine passports or other measures to keep themselves safe. So my long-term message is we will move again. And that face-to-face experience for New Zealanders, that manaakitanga we show others, is so important to us that we have to keep building to be able to move again. But when we do that, I want to do so in a way that preserves our position, that enables us to have the freedoms we've had, that prepares us for what may yet come, particularly in the form of variants, because once you preserve that position, it's easier to maintain than it is to restore if you lose it. But you will travel again. You will.
Thanks. There is a question here, 48 likes, so I'm going to ask this one. What will the role of New Zealand be should China invade the island of Taiwan?
Sorry, I can see that's a very popular question, but as you can imagine, I'm going to give a very benign answer to that. And that's simply because, well, the first thing I'd say that when it comes to New Zealand and our relationship with China, or indeed any other nation, we are very predictable. So you can anticipate when we see heightened issues or human rights abuses in Xinjiang involving the Uyghurs, you know what we'll say. We, of course, will defend and speak out on behalf of human rights. And we will use multilateral institutions and tools to try and have others speak alongside those issues. And we will also use our access to raise issues privately and also publicly. So we're very predictable in the way that New Zealand behaves, and we'll continue to do so. And if we see any heightened issues, Hong Kong's been an example where we don't have to come to a theoretical, you will see the way we respond, which is we will continue to escalate and raise our voice as our concerns are heightened by activity that we see in the region.
Mm-hmm. Last question, because I'm aware that media need to leave and have a stand-up with you soon. There's lots here, and I'm hoping that our journalist friends will ask some of them to you and report on them so everyone gets the answers. Aren't Pacific leaders fairly skeptical of the Indo-Pacific concept, seeing it as an attempt by outsiders to define the region? How do you bring them on board with this concept?
Well, actually, I mean, for that question, I would not speak on behalf of other Pacific leaders. That's again, I think that happens too often in our region. So all I can present is our perspective, and that's why you will have heard me at first and foremost anchor ourselves within the Pacific and then look more broadly beyond it. And in that regard, if I could briefly just acknowledge the importance of, as an arrangement and as an institution, the Pacific Island Forum for New Zealand. It's had disruptions in the past, but I increasingly see that as an important forum for us to make sure that we are, within our own region, elevating those areas of interest, working collectively. There is no issue that you will see on their agenda more often and more heightened than the likes of climate change. We must continue to elevate fora like that give the Pacific the ability to share their voice within the Indo-Pacific. And so I see that as really being critical.
Mm. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. So thank you very much, Prime Minister, for a very comprehensive address. You've traversed many issues and geographies, which I think give us a lot to consider as we delve further into the conversation throughout the conference. Thank you very much.